during, after, or if you want to email me here at Western, chris.friday@wwu.edu, and tell me what I should have done that I didn't do, and tell me what I might do that would be helpful. I would really appreciate it. I'll try to give you just a really, really short background before I launch into things. This comes from my Uncle Bill, who I've known all my life. I was born the day before his 16th birthday, which he never quite forgave me for, because there was supposed to be a big adventure. His family was going to go on this outing, and for some reason I interrupted that. So, but we've gotten along well all these years, and he's been an important figure and continues to be a really important figure in my life. And so he told me he was writing his memoirs. So I said, well, why don't you send them to me? And I started reading them, and I said, well, I've got to help you do something with this. And so this is my motivational attempt to do that. I thought if I committed to doing this, I'd have to start putting it together and working with what he had. So what you see today is my first attempt really to put together some of the materials that Bill has passed on to me and all these things. By the way, the background that I have is Bill's Impressionist watercolor from 1960. And it's one of the things that got him a scholarship to college, along with several other things. So we'll come to that later. So I thought it would be a kind of fitting tribute to him. He's not tech savvy, or otherwise he might be here. And I think it'd be really intimidating to have him here. You know, I'll send the recording to him and see what he complains about, and he'll just be sure and let me know what I did wrong on this one. So I'm going to go ahead and share screen here with you folks, and I'll just launch into the to this. I'll get the chat up just in case, but EJ's going to kind of follow that along there for us. So this is about my Uncle Bill, as I said. This is a drawing he did of a sketch that he did of two brothers in the 1980s, but they're two brothers that he had known a good portion of his life and kind of grew up around. And so they were not obviously, but they were gay, and they knew Bill, and they shared that relationship all along the way here. So why this project? One key thing is Bill wanted to tell his story. And he wanted to tell people about what it had been like for him growing up in rural Oregon, living and working in rural Oregon. And so I want to give him that chance. I think it's a story worth hearing, honestly. I think it's fascinating, tearful, happy, all these kinds of things. And I love my uncle for who he is. And he has really never tried to be anything other than what he is and who he is, right? He stands to his own drummer most of his life. Now, for my parents, that oftentimes was I was told, you know, Uncle Bill's a great guy, he's lots of fun, but don't grow up to be like Uncle Bill. I wish my parents had become more like Uncle Bill at different points in time. And so I think this is also my chance to honor him and the life he's has lived and continues to live. I think there's another thing here, is that we know a lot less about rural and small town queer experiences than we know about urban queer experiences. And I think that's worth continuing to unpack and think about the relationships between urban places and rural places, because they don't exist in entire isolation. But I think there's something that we want to be able to do there. I think it's also important to consider history. I mean, unfortunately for a lot of my students, I'm a historian, and so we end up trying to build the context around things. But I think we'll come back to this, but I think that's an important thing, because there's a lot of things that happened a lot earlier than we thought they might have happened. And there are a lot of things that are surprisingly recent. It wasn't that long ago that certain things were in place, and we'll come to a couple of those as we go through today. I think the story also helps us understand the costs of a lifetime of being questioned all the time. And especially for Bill, being gay has meant that he's always had to justify himself in some fashion. And I think that's worth recognizing and thinking about. And I think that where we are now with ideas about gender fluidity and fluid sexual identities and so on, it doesn't mean that it's easy, but I think appreciating how difficult that has been for people before us is important. So I'll also say this, there's a lot of theory that underpins what I'm thinking, what I'm about. I have a giant stack over to the side of all kinds of important academic books on LGBTQI histories and theories and so on. But today I mostly want to share Bill's thoughts about his life and look to you folks for help sorting it out. What observations might you have? So why me? I'm a cisgendered white male, right? I've got it right up front. I have to out myself on that regard. I have some academic knowledge, but as Lauren is pointed out in one class, cultural competency does not mean cultural humility. And we can just say that competency doesn't necessarily mean humility. And I'd like to try to remain humble and put myself in a place where I can continue to learn and grow from sharing the story and from hearing from other people how they understand this story and their own perspectives. I have a lot of immediate personal experiences beyond Bill, right? I have a gender fluid adult child. I had a father-in-law and a mother-in-law who died of HIV/AIDS. I had a sister-in-laws, plural, who are lesbian. One's out and one's not out. One's partnered with a transgender person, one's not partnered at all. I should also say that the first employer I remember my father having was a gay couple in the early 1960s. Two artists and a mixed race relationship as well. So I've been around it all my cognizant life. But again, it just doesn't make me an expert, but I hope it's making me an ally here. So some of the things, all the artwork that you see are sketches and drawings by Bill at various points in time, and he's got them mostly dated here. And this one's, the top one says Friday, 1968, and some of them aren't dated. But I want to look at the question of coming out, a little bit about him growing up being closeted, what kind of connections he was able to establish, and Connections Desired is actually from a title of a book about rural gay experiences. And some of the rural realities and personal costs, and then maybe like what kind of role model is someone like Bill, and what has he been able to do? So one of the things that at the very first pages of Bill's writing is he wrote this about coming out. He said, it isn't something you do just once, like registering for the draft or getting your driver's license. It's a continual and ongoing thing. If you really intend to come out, then to prepare to do it 1,000 times or more. And this really struck me, right? As a cisgendered male, I don't have to out myself very often, right? I just get to be. But Bill has had to again and again and again and again contend with being out, sometimes back in and sometimes around and about the closet. So just really quickly, this is Bill on the littlest one here on the side, and you can always tell one of the Friday children because they have giant ears. My father is the oldest of these three boys on the upper right, and then that's Harlow, and then Jim is the other brother there, and his mother Harriet, and his father Charles, or Chuck as he was known. So little Billy Friday is there. Bill was born in 1942 in Eastern Oregon. For a while prior to that, his family had lived in Idaho. That's where my father was born. Bill was the third son, and each of his kids were born about 2 years apart. So, really kind of mid-century looking family, right, in their appearance. His father's a mechanic in a large farm in Hermiston, Oregon at the time. And Hermiston is famous for growing at that point lots and lots of onions. He's a second generation Swiss American. The Freitag family is still from a little tiny village in Switzerland. And his family moved in the 1870s. Bill's mom, my grandmother, was an elementary school teacher and sometimes beauty shop operator, and she came out of French-Canadian heritage. And Bill's actually probably in some ways more proud of French-Canadian. He celebrates Bastille Day every July in his weird, quirky way. As an adult, Bill was an artist, has been an artist, a cartoonist, a Forest Service worker. A lot of times he worked on survey crews, but also worked in fire lookout towers in Oregon. And he was a very accomplished tennis player too, which we'll come back to. So when did Bill know he was queer? When did he realize this? Well, you know, he has a memory from his mother that his mother took him during the war to the USO Servicemen's Club in Hermiston, Oregon, and all the men, you know, were excited to have the baby there as they were going off to war and so on. And Bill said, well, you know, I must have loved the attention that all these men gave me because it stuck with me. Now, you know, that's a story that Bill built into his way of understanding things. But Bill says in his memoirs that, you know, he enjoyed playing smooching games and trying not to get caught with boys, right? And what does this indicate? It's hard to say, right? But it's pretty clear that early on, Bill is not afraid or is attracted to men. In junior high school and even in high school, he remembers and recalls intimate locker room engagements that were kind of snuck whenever possible. Test preparation overnights were a good opportunity as he saw them. So it's really clear that even as a teenager, Bill was engaged in same-sex relations, right, and same-sex pairings. And so this idea about what, you know, when did Bill know? It seems like you know, as soon as he sort of became aware that there was another world and other people around him, that he began to identify as gay. He had lots of opportunities in various colleges. He actually went to 3 different colleges and never quite graduated. He kept getting scholarships, flunking out, getting scholarships and flunking out. But a lot of these were young and, you know, sort of fleeting things. And so we'll come to sort of more lasting things here a bit later. But he had a lot of art classes that he was involved in, and you can see some of his sketches. And this, in some ways, gave him the freedom to express his interest in not only human bodies, but men's bodies, and to establish relationships with men's. In some ways that, if he had not been in the arts, he might not have been able to do so as easily. And he formed a series and was involved in a series of collectives, which I'll talk about in a little bit here. And so he was in a number of safe spaces all the way through his 20s, right? And he wasn't fully out until his 30s, right? So it took him quite some time to come out, and we'll come to that too. I think this is a funny one. Bill joined the National Guard in 1968, 69 in order to not have to go to Vietnam. And when he had his picture taken here, he took the guy's glasses next to him and put them on. Bill's a bit of a prankster and a bit of a jokester too. So knowing Bill, it's hard to imagine him in the military in any way, shape, or form. But I think this is understandable and comprehensible given the time frame, right? He was not interested in going to Vietnam, did not want to try to be there. And so he did his best to not do it by joining the National Guard. Bill came out in public in 1975. So he was 33 years old. And he couldn't come out, or he didn't come out publicly broadly until after his father died. His father died in November 1974. And so it was a year later. And I'll try to come back and tell you why a little bit. Here's a portrait Bill did of himself in 1975. Bill came out in 1975 on a regional TV talk show host about being homosexual, right? So that's quite a public outing there that he chose to step forward and do this. In the same year, he met his partner, or he brought his partner Franz to our house for Thanksgiving. It was sort of the first family outing. And so even there, Bill's mother could never quite introduce Franz as anything other than Bill's friend. So she could get partway there, but only partway. His brothers seemed to know, but as I said earlier, there were some unclear and mixed messages about, Uncle Bill. Uncle Bill's a great guy, but was kind of the subtext. And the but seemed to be about, his choice not to work year round at things, his choice to be an artist rather than get a real job. But also there were tensions around his sexuality with his brothers from time to time. So here we are after my grandfather's funeral. There's Bill on the left. My father is going bald with the mustache. My other uncle, Jim's middle brother there on that side. And then my mother on the far right. And the large dorky looking guy in the far back is me at about age 15. So, this is our, family. And these are my four cousins here who are Jim and Kay's children with my father Harlow and my mother Anna. So when Bill came out, right, at least the way he explains it, he said, when I came out during a televised discussion on being gay in Oregon, it was my way of weighing in with a positive note to show that being gay can simply mean being an individual who is capable of expressing one's love for a fellow man without succumbing, to the perceived social behavior expectations. He wanted to be able to say, I'm a man, I love other men. I don't have to be anything other than who I am, right? I don't have to be what you might expect. In fact, Bill oftentimes says, and he's said to me over the last, 30 years, that he prefers the label queer or homosexual for himself rather than gay. And Bill's not likely to appear immediately gay to those who don't know him, because he does not, he doesn't have any affectation other than sort of masculinist, man, male kind of thing. And he believes that being obviously and flamboyantly gay, and I'll put that in quotes, his idea is that it plays into heteronormative expectations about what gay people are supposed to be like. So for him, in some ways, it's more challenging and subversive to not act, at least in his mind, what gay means, and to sort of present a challenge. He says when you have a highly performative or affected kind of behavior, they, meaning heteronormative or cisgender people, feel more secure knowing that you're not one of them. He asks, how can you properly discriminate if you can't readily identify that which you fear? He said, the fear of being suspected of having even the slightest gay tendencies consumes far too many heterosexuals and sends some of them into expressing those fears in open, harsh, and ugly ways. But then he says, look, almost every male has in their youth had a shared, mutually highly affectionate encounter with a friend at an early age. And then, unfortunately, too many of them spend the rest of their life acting out openly against openly gay people and their agendas. And these are quotes from Bill's memoir, right? And I still have to, do some editing on them, but kind of bring them in here so you have a little bit of his voice. Bill spent some time in his memoirs talking about some other people he knew, and I think he was using this to illustrate a kind of range of people's experiences. For example, he talked about a lesbian friend who came from a rural setting, and she went out and agonized for many, many years, didn't come out until her mid-20s, about telling her mom and coming out to her mom. When she told her mom said, oh, thank heavens, I was worried you're going to tell me you were pregnant, right? So it was a non-event for the mom. And so her family of origin accepted her. So Bill's, acknowledging there, sometimes we get ourselves worked up about these things, and it's not as hard as we think. But then he had another friend, acquaintance, well, not an acquaintance, a close friend, who was a journalism major at the University of Oregon in the early 1970s. who'd gone all the way out here from New York City pretty much to get as far away from his family as possible. And Jerome called his father at one point and said, I thought you should know, I've come out to my friends here that I'm gay. We can talk about it when I come home for spring break. After a lot of shouting on the phone, the father said, oh God, no. Well, that does it. Have you considered the alternative? Jerome said, well, what's that? What alternative? And according to Bill, Jerome's father said, suicide, you rotten little shit, suicide. So Jerome, not without good reason, focused on his family of choice rather than his family of origin. And Jerome became a good poet and university instructor, right? He went on to live a life that he chose, and he and Bill maintained relationships for many years after that too. Bill had also another person he talked about whose name was Dodd. I won't give you the full name here. He was Malaysian, and he had come to first study in Australia and then at University of Oregon to study psychology in graduate school, funded fully by the government of Malaysia to do this. In Dodd's homeland, homosexuality was a capital offense. You would be sentenced to death if you were discovered to be a homosexual in that point in time. But because his studies were funded by his homeland, he had to return once he finished his degree. He had no choice but to go back. So whatever openness he found about being in a small college town in the 1970s was a thing of the past. He had to go back, really back into that closet. And so I think Bill's discussing these three different experiences is to say, look, his own experience is not everybody's, that there are many different comings out that happen and that they vary a lot amongst people. Bill also talked about another kind of example, a Boy Scout fraternity that he formed when he was in Southern Oregon College in 1962 after he'd failed out of a couple other colleges. With two former acquaintances from his Boy Scout days, they formed a Boy Scout fraternity at the school, a kind of club for camping and hiking trips. And this was a way for them to find semi-clandestine spaces for relationships, right? They would go out on these hiking trips, camp over the weekend, and be what they felt was in a safe space to enjoy same-sex relations. Those two people, though, married their college girlfriends, right? So they were clearly closeted and they had children. But both of them came out just after Stonewall in 1969, right? They went through this transformation. But when they did that, they had to abandon their families. And even though they became the life of the party, the gay scene in Salem and Portland where these two folks lived, it's pretty clear that the choices they faced weren't easy at all, that they came at great costs, right? First to be closeted, then to, have a family, feel the pressure to have a family, but still, even if you have a family, it doesn't mean you don't have feelings for them if you're gay. And, not having access to your kids anymore was hard on these folks. Well, Bill's coming out was, as I said, after his father died, and he had a much better relationship with his mother, and she was much more liberal than his father. But he told his mother in 1975, he said, when I introduced her to Franz and explained she had just gained another son, who would be more than willing to mow her lawn, trim her hedge and tend her roses, and rake the leaves from her half-acre property, right? There's Bill and Harriet there, and there's Franz gardening, and there's, by the way, Bill and Franz are still together today. They've been, will be together, have been together 50 years this fall. Pretty remarkable for any couple, I would say. Apparently Bill's mom said, gained a son? Yes, I can certainly use help around here, and most of my neighbors can too. There were a lot of older retired widows around him. We'll be happy to pay him for his services, right? And so she actually employed him for the next 15 years, 20 years, doing yard work in and around that place and everywhere else in the neighborhood, right? So she did embrace Franz, and she did get along with him, and she knew that Bill and Franz had a very close and deep relationship. She could just never quite get past the friend stage, right? To explain things. But it wasn't always smooth for Bill or for Harriet. So he recounts going, no, this is not my part of the family, it's another wing of the family, so I'm gonna let them hang out to dry on this one. But he drove about 100 miles north from where my grandmother was living in Eugene, took her up to a Thanksgiving dinner with one side of the family. Of course, after dinner in the 1970s, there was gender segregation. All the men went to the TV room and all the women went to the kitchen. And they're going to watch football. And Bill and one other person said, oh, they really wanted to watch the tennis match. Well, Bill's uncle on that side said, no, tennis is a queer sport and not for real men. And so Bill kind of said, screw you. I'm going to go watch TV in some other room. And he did. But then the uncle put his children up, his nephews up to running through the house chanting, smear the queer, and running through the room where Bill was trying to watch television. Meanwhile, the women told Bill's mother that she'd been too domineering because she was worked as a teacher and ran a beauty parlor, that emasculated her husband and made her son gay, right? And this was pretty common in the 1970s. Oh, you're gay because your mother was domineering and your father was emasculated somehow. So on the long drive home, he and his mother shared their respective stories with each other. You won't believe what happened to me. Well, you won't believe what happened to me. And according to Bill, they sang songs together most of the rest of the way home. And he said, this seemed to heal the wounds of being exposed to that den of oppressive, homophobic, and ignorant relatives who, like many straights, seem to thrive on violence. And Bill saw this as his defense against being smeared, right? At least a defense that he could mount at the time. And I have to say, Bill really doesn't have any more interactions with that whole wing of the family. Well, as said, Bill worked in rural spaces, did Forest Service work surveying first, and then ultimately one of the most expert and experienced fire lookout workers and instructors for the Forest Service in Eastern Oregon. And here's one of his renditions of Fox Butte. By the way, this is the lookout tower where my mom and dad were in summer of 1959, and my mom was pregnant with me. And they lived up here. This wasn't there at the time, so they just lived in that tiny little thing at the top. Bill recounted that the supervisors, when they sent out replacement workers, so they would, he would be like 10 days on and then 4 days off, and they would send out replacement workers. And they would have him go through his personal items and his mail for evidence of anything of a homosexual nature, right? So they were asking his fellow workers to spy on him. And they admitted this to him too. Now, Bill didn't help matters sometimes. He had to paint a remote outhouse once as part of his duties. So he painted, in his artistic style, naked cherubs urinating from the clouds inside the outhouse. Now, it wasn't necessarily gay, but it certainly was risque. And Bill spent a lot of his time and efforts poking fun at the Forest Service. Here's a cartoon of Hokey the bear instead of Smokey the bear. And he did a whole bunch of risque Smokey the Bear cartoons on napkins for local cafes and bars and stuff too. A number of things that got put out there. In fact, Bill was really, really popular at local cafes and taverns all throughout Central and Eastern Oregon. He'd show up, he has a great sense of humor, he could sketch out things. So here's what Bill says, oh, this napkin cartoon was a lame one, he said, but he could draw things like this out in just a matter of seconds, right? And some sort of funny play on things or a character or something. And these little taverns and cafes and bars would put his napkins up all over the place. And at one point, he even had a private booth in one of them. Well, word got out that he was gay, or at one point he wore a gay pride t-shirt, and then down came the cartoons. He said at these places, his meals started getting messed with and his car would get vandalized. And so as soon as it became clear in these rural small towns that he was gay, he got attacked, or he felt like he got attacked. At another point in time, Bill was working as an industrial drawing person, so he made a whole series of these industrial designs. This would be stuff that's done by computer-assisted design now, but Bill was so good at drafting things that he could get these sort of perspectives and dimensions. But he lost his job when the other employees found out. The supervisors at the site let the workers continually harass him at work and in the parking lot, and basically drove him out of the job. The problem for Bill was he loved the outdoors so much. He loved rural Oregon so much. He loved being out there that he turned down urban jobs to be in that setting, right? And so I think kind of going back to that watercolor that's behind me in my virtual screen, you know, Bill was really taken by the rural landscape, wherever he was. Now, the cartoon, the gay pride t-shirt that apparently got Bill in trouble in that one job was the Cascade Athletic Pride Association. Bill created the logo for this, and he played on, coached and played on the tennis team for this Pride Association at the World Gay Games in Vancouver, BC, and actually won a gold medal in his age category in doubles tournament there. And so here's Bill, a not great picture, a photocopy of a picture of Bill from the Gay Games in 1990 in Vancouver. And so, you know, he couldn't do the things openly that he loved unless he was closeted in these rural spaces, because it meant losing your jobs. It meant being attacked verbally, having his car vandalized, and so on. In fact, he lost his job for wearing this t-shirt one day. Somebody saw the triangle underneath another shirt that he had on, and that's what lost him the job. And I think that forced Bill to be subtle or coded in a lot of his cartoons. You know, he put this drawing out, this sort of sketch out, let's all band together now, and that could mean any kind of things. But in other settings, he redrew this or rebranded it here. Let's all band together now to do our part to prevent discrimination against LGBTQ community in general, right? And so he was not, you know, many times he was not able to be fully out. And I think understandably, you can see why he was sometimes cautious about things. It's ironic because he was otherwise fearless when it came to party politics. You know, he was a devout socialist, if not a Trotskyite, and very, very active for environmental causes. You know, continues to support the Southern Poverty Law Center and all kinds of things in his activities. But in this setting, it was much harder for him to be openly gay than it was to be openly socialist, strangely enough. You know, Bill talked about other kinds of difficulties that would happen too in rural spaces. And I think this one is hard to talk about. Bill talked about out-of-towners coming in, especially in the 1970s. And then by this he meant sort of urban gay activists who oftentimes toured through rural spaces looking to out-closeted gays in these spaces. I think Bill appreciated the fact that they outed local clergy and politicians for their hypocrisy, right? The very voices that were oftentimes anti-gay or homophobic were the very people who were clandestinely, you know, engaging in same-sex relations, you know, secretly on the side. The problem for Bill was that he was known in circles as being gay because of his connections to other places. And they volunteered him to host them, right? They would show up and say, okay, we're going to go do this, right? We're going to go about town. And these out-of-towners were openly and flamboyantly and aggressively gay in public. And for Bill, it was uncomfortable, right? It means that the very delicate balance that he was trying to negotiate where he was, it was disrupted by this thing. And it was not only uncomfortable, but potentially even dangerous. And we'll kind of come back to that a little bit, I hope, here. Yes. So, you know, Central and Eastern Oregon are remote and beautiful, right? Even to this day, gay couples oftentimes think of it as idyllic, and there's a kind of back to the land experience after a lifetime or many years of urban experiences. But as Bill recounts another place in his memoirs, you know, fairly recently, a couple bought a lodge for a retreat, and they were driven away by corrupt and violent locals who benefited from buying low from couples that they drove away and selling high to the next set of gay couples who might come into this place, right? They're this strange sort of revolving door. He had talked about another couple who were retired. One of them was a teacher, retired teacher, and they bought a B&B, and they were harassed so much that they returned to Seattle from Eastern Oregon. He talked about antique shop owners who were driven out by tirades from a local evangelical preacher who encouraged, by all appearances, his flock to shoplift, vandalize customers' cars, right? And so they just gave up and went back to Portland at a great loss. And I know personally, very near to Bellingham here is a little artsy town of Boeds, and there's a gay couple there who are artists and antique dealers. They have done tons of things like installations for anthropology and you know, pretty big time stuff. They've shuttered their place because of hostility from locals and Harley riding bikers who frequent this tavern across the way. They still fly their gay pride flag, but their business is no more because they just were so unhappy there. Now, you know, this is a pretty white bourgeois coupled vision of gay life, right? But this is the world in which Bill has operated and the way he's thinking. And so it's not the queer experience that everybody has, but it is one of many different kinds of queer experiences and sets of queer experiences. So I kind of wanted to draw that out a little bit for you. The real realities are that Oregon, even though Oregon has the highest percentage of LGBTQ people in the country, according to 2019-2020 statistics, it has one of the also highest rates of hate crimes based on sexuality and gender, and one of the highest hate crime rates among states too. So even though on one measure, Oregon looks like, oh, this is a great place, it's also one of the worst places. Just by comparison, Washington's not much better. Washington ranks number 5 in the percentage of LGBTQ people in the country, just slightly lower than Oregon. But it has the highest ratio of hate crimes motivated by sexual and gender identity in the country. And it's in fact number 2 overall in the country for hate crimes. So the thing is, as many of you know who are in and around Washington, and Oregon, the moment we get out of these sort of urban bubbles, we become very quickly into other kinds of spaces. And I think this is one of the things that Bill's life illustrates for us. Rural areas continue to have more hate groups and individuals in more prominent roles in those societies and active. And lots of times local authorities don't record hate crimes, so we don't have good statistics at all. And there are a lot of tacit things that happen, a lot of covert things that happen. Evictions and job losses based on hate seem to be consistently higher than in most urban places. And gay men in particular seem to be the most targeted in rural areas, even to this day. So we don't have to look very far back to look at things like Matthew Shepard, who you may know about in 1998 and in Rocky Mountain States area and Northern Plains, or in West Virginia, J.R. Warren. Now we know about Shepard because it got a lot of media. He was a young white man. And we have the Laramie Project. That's a really interesting kind of public awareness and play to kind of highlight these issues. But we don't know about Warren from West Virginia, who was gay, Black, and had learning disabilities, who was beaten to death by 2 young white sex partners. And then they ran over him several times to make it look like a hit and run death. There's no commemoration for him, right? And so I think that we may feel good about what we're doing about Matthew Shepard and Laramie Project, but there are many, 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 many other rural incidences that we need to be aware of. And my real point here is it's dangerous to be gay in rural spaces. It's dangerous to be gay in lots of spaces. It's especially dangerous to be gay in rural places. So when I said Bill was subtle and coded in a lot of his cartoons, this is one illustration that he did, a kind of joke, where the farmer says, "Grant, stop painting that barn and come give me a hand with this darn machine. He'll never amount to a hill of," right? This is the caption. And Grant is in the background painting the barn on canvas. And I think that's Bill's way of saying, you know, you have to find artistic ways to express your gender and sexuality, your choices here. You know, to be artistic is not to be masculine, fixing machinery and so on. And for Bill, this is a way to sort of make a comment about this. Very subtly and not in your face, but that's one way he was able to deal with this. Here's Franz, his partner, a few years ago at age 56, and Bill drew a self-portrait at age 64. So they've been together quite some time, as I noted to you earlier. Bill wrote to me. He sends me about 3 letters a week. He puts about 20 stamps on each letter, and he says he's supporting the U.S. Postal Service. He wrote me and he told me about some new neighbors near him in Central Oregon who were trying to whip up homophobic sentiments about the 2 old queers that live down the street, meaning Bill and Franz. Their fence and yard have been vandalized. And fortunately for them, longer-term neighbors refuse to play along, and it seems to have quieted down some. But that just reminds me that this is not something that's ever been over for Bill, right? That he is still facing lots of homophobia. And I think that anything that happens now, Bill has a tendency to attribute it to homophobia, whether or not it is. That he's been so conditioned over this time period. So, you know, he's not paranoid, right? It's not an individual trait, but it's been something that's built into him, into his life by these outside forces, right? So a whole lifetime of living with this. So Bill says, unless you're extremely tolerant of small-minded, bigoted, anti-gay, anti-art, anti-science, political fanatics, he's not pulling any punch here, unable to accept any kind of or mental enlightenment, any small town rural opportunity should be very closely examined by anyone in the gay community hoping to start a new life in a quaint outback setting. So I'm putting this in because of Bill's request. He told me that anytime we put anything out in print, anytime I talk in public about anything that he's ever done, he wants me to say that suicide's not an option. Don't give up. Help is available if you ask. If you're worried about things, there are people ready to intervene in your personal crisis, right? Provide you a kind of supportive home or community, right? Families of choice rather than families of origin if you need. So don't go the route that Jerome's father recommended. Now, Bill's not naive. He really does worry and care, right? So I told him I'd put the National Suicide Prevention Hotline up there. There's a lot of other things too. Trevor Project, LGBT National Help Center. There's a youth talk line. There's a trans type talk line, lifeline. Pride Institute has a lot of great resources. You can text to certain things. And there's even an LGBT elder hotline for people like Bill and Franz if they're confronting these types of things. And then both for you folks at SPSCC and WWU, right? So EJ's, where he's currently working, is the go-to place. And at Western, we have LGBTQ at www.edu, right? So these are places you can get to. And so make sure that you avail yourself of those things. So one of the things I wanted to do was sort of say, okay, being out one time, right, it's not a one-time thing or a one-size-fits-all. It's different for lots and lots of people. It's different for Bill when he came out to his friends. It's different to Bill when he came out to his family. at work, and so on. And, you know, what are safe and unsafe places? You know, what happens when you've been outed and you don't have a choice? Or outing others intentionally or unintentionally, you know, those kinds of things. And I don't know if you wanted to sort of add anything in chat here, or if you wanted to step back a little bit. I mean, I have more things to talk about from Bill, but I think the big one was about this sort of in, out, and about the closet for him. And there's some other really fun things that I can do that are a little less weighty, but are there any thoughts you folks have on this? Is it an ongoing process for people, or is it one and done?
I know for
I
myself,
feel like stopped coming out.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was just saying that I feel like I come out all the time, and I'm 38 years old, and I came out when I was 16, and I still, to this day, have to tell people, this is my fiance, his name's Rusty, I'm gay, but it never ends.
Yeah. I think that's a big thing, you know, for cisgendered hetero folks. You don't have to come out all the time. Only in the last few years are we sort of expected to sort of, hey, you should have to, you know, say where you stand on things too, if you're going to require that same of us, right? And so I get that, but you know, I appreciate your sharing that. Is that Bert? I said I lost you on there. EJ, you were going to say something.
Oh, that was me. I responded.
I was also going to say, you know, as a trans person myself, it is an everyday thing, whether people see it or not. And getting misgendered, it's like, by the way, no, those are the wrong pronouns. So I was just saying, yeah, for basically, it's an all the time coming out process from the time you do on.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that really struck me. You know, I knew about it in the sort of intellectual way, but really hearing Bill talk about it and write about it really brought it home for me. And so I thought that was a really important thing to talk about. So thank you for sharing, you know, and if you have more to let me know about that, I'm happy to let you tell me about your experiences if you want to. I'll keep rolling here for a minute. This is Bill's ideal man, by the way. If you know the Da Vinci thing, right? I just thought, I love this one. Bill's a quirky guy, right? Bill's father, let's look a little bit at Bill here and some of the things he did. You know, his father was a military marksman, a card and pool and checkers hustler, a golf and tennis expert, nearly pro at those things. He went to rural Idaho from Chicago in the 1930s to trap fur with his brother, probably because he'd gotten himself in trouble in Chicago. He was a local National Guard warrant officer in World War II, and he had his sons join the National Rifle Association and Boy Scouts, right? So kind of his day, very masculinist, right? This is kind of what real men were supposed to do, which is kind of why I put the real man and the clown or the ideal man before this. The Friday Boys, Harlow, Jim, and Bill, were notorious for being rowdy. They set fires annually to this field next to them, to the point where one year the fire department called up my grandmother and said, aren't the boys going to set the field on fire? We need to practice putting out fires. They built a giant slingshot out of rubber tubes and put fist-sized rocks into the barn across the road, and, you know, all kinds of terrible things. Their father would dump them off in the mountains for a week at a time when they were in their early teens and say, okay, survive, I'll come back and get you in a week. And so, you know, in a way, this is sort of this mid-century rural rough masculinity. Their mother was a super tolerant person, and she kind of let it go. And his father always said, boys will be boys. So I like this picture of the twin shark. They built this pontoon boat on the Umpqua River, where they, or actually it's Rogue River here. And I like this because there's Harlow and the middle brother Jim out in the water, and here's Bill in a close relationship with another young boy. And so, you know, this kind of rough and tumble world still had this space for someone like Bill. In fact, here's Bill at age 14. He has a fake beard on, dressing up like a mountain man because that's what sort of the family pressure was about. Bill's father built a tennis court in his backyard for his sons in the late 40s and early 50s. But local town leaders came to him and said, tennis is a gay sport. And if you put this up, you might not get business in your garage. He was a mechanic, EJ, he was a car mechanic. And his wife's job as a teacher might also be in jeopardy, right? So there's a threat in the whole family. If you do anything that vaguely looks like it might be Tennessee and gay, you can't do that. Well, about the same time, there's a very famous tennis player, Big Ben Tilden, who had been active from the 19-teens to the 1940s, who was in a big sex scandal, homosexual sex scandal in Los Angeles in 1946 and again in 49. He was arrested for having sex with a young man in a car in Beverly Hills. And by the way, there were laws against sodomy in California until 1976. So this is one of those things where I was in high school in 1976, right? This is really, that's a time period when in my little mind, we should not be having these laws still on the books, right? And yet they're still there even that time. So this is where I think one of those things where things happen much more recently. Now, I know many of you, 1976 is long before you were born and these types of things, but I think it is recent. It is really recent, all right? Really recent for people like me and certainly for Bill. So Bill's father used the car lot or the tennis court for a car lot for his mechanic workshop instead, and so never got to play tennis. And he forbade Bill to ever play tennis, but Bill secretly learned to play tennis anyway, and was eventually invited to be a pro at a tennis club in Hawaii. He didn't take them up on it. He wanted to stay in Oregon, but he was good enough. And as I told you before, he participated in the World Gay Games in tennis later. His dad also had been the high muckety-muck Boy Scout leader in all of Oregon, but got demoted to town leadership when it turned out another leader, a Boy Scout leader that he knew was exposed as being gay. And there's all these sort of fears of predatory men seeking young boys and so on. And this is the same time that the Boys of Boise erupted. Now, John Jarashi wrote a kind of journalistic thing, and Peter Bogue wrote an introduction to the Boys of Boise, which I helped get republished for the University of Washington Press if you want to learn more about this. But gay men in town were involved with more than 100 boys and young men over the time, but it hit the national news media and so on. And this is like at the height of McCarthyism and paranoia. Some 1,500 people in Boise were questioned. 15 people were sentenced, some to life in prison for engaging in same-sex activities in and around Boise. This, and by the way, my family, my grandfather and before Bill was born, lived near Boise. So this was right there in their neighborhood, right? So this is the world of his father. Well, Bill said that of his father then, he had an avid hatred of unionists and queers. He said, all my life I had to listen to his comments, and there were some pretty brutal comments. He said it was really distracting and disturbing. After all, I was one of those queers he was referring to. In fact, he told Bill at one point, son, never let a queer get you in his hooks or you'll never get away. And Bill said, little did he know, that's just what I was dying to have occur, right? And so it's at this point, when Bill is doing his, sketches with watercolor washes and so on. So another kind of question for you folks is, what were the expectations for you and yours growing up? What kind of pressures did you have? How are you part of your times? Is it easier? Is it harder? Do you have to be coded? How different is it historically and culturally from someone like Bill? Have things really changed or not? By the way, I put this illustration in because first of all, Bill can never spell, because so he misspelled potatoes. but you know, the potatoes sitting over there, just my luck, fine bottle of wine, pleasant evening, but nothing but a bunch of fruits and nuts, right? And I think this is a comment about, you know, heterosexual people not being boring and you know, not in being able to enjoy their evenings too. So, you know, you know, just put it plainly, if many of you you're all younger than Bill, has things changed that much? Or is it still, are there a lot of messages that you're getting and have gotten that are extremely negative as you've gone along the way? I guess I'm curious to hear at some point. You don't have to do it right now, but Bert, your little box.
I think it has gotten better. I live and work in a very rural area, Central Washington, Yakima, and I work in mental health. I do feel like it's gotten a little better, in Yakima at least. But where I used to live, which is on the Yakima reservation, it was just like how Bill explained it.
Yeah,
exactly like that. Kind of like how his dad said what he said. My dad said to me, "When you get AIDS and are dying, don't come crying to me." But I mean, now my parents are super accepting. They love my partner. But when I came out at 16, it was not a happy thing. And for years after that, when I went to WSU, I had a hate crime happen to me twice there. So, but it's gotten better in recent years, I think, in my opinion.
You know, I'm glad to hear that parents can shift and change. You know, that they can sometimes let the love that they have take them through some of these things where their initial reactions might be pretty gnarly and negative. So, you know, it's nice to hear that can happen. But it, you know, and I want to pick on WSU. I mean, I think college campuses all over the place continue to have these same kinds of issues, even at Western, from what I see. So, I want to tell you about a kind of move into something else. If you guys were happy to have me talk a little bit more, or okay with me talking a bit more. You know, Bill survived and thrived in the 60s and 70s and 80s beyond because he was able to make connections. And one of those connections was a collective. 7 to 8, and kind of the numbers shifted over time, but a gay men got together and pooled their resources and bought this funky experimental house designed by architecture students in Eugene that they called the Van Ness Collective, and Van Ness was the street that it was on. And they ran it as a co-op. They voted on all the decisions that they did, and they had to have a majority vote and a consensus in addition to that. But they used it as a base for themselves for art. There were a lot of people who were painters, built a lot of pottery too, musicians, but there were scientists there as well. And it was a big, important social spot. And they also helped out other gay men who were evicted from housing. So they had a series of people kind of coming in and out of the house too, as a kind of safe space. So I think this Van Ness Collective was really important for Bill. And he took action right here in Eugene. Now, Eugene at that point was a really small college town, right? And college towns are different, but they're not always the site of literalness. Bill said it was an idyllic setting that seemed like it might never end, but personal differences, lifestyle changes, jobs, and they parted ways after this, after about 8 or 9 years. And they agreed to sell and move on to opportunities in other places. Here's one of Bill's sketches of the place, and he has some other great color ones. Bill, I probably have 5,000 to 6,000 of Bill's illustrations, and they're just in huge stacks that he handed to me when I went to visit him last fall. So I'm still sorting my way through them. So some of the pictures aren't great, but this is a black and white version that he did. Another was the Holding Together Coffee House. In fact, it was opened and run by members of the Van Ness Collective, and they designed it as a place for gay men to socialize, exhibit art. Bill had a couple there. And 2 of the people who were founders of the coffee house also founded the Gay People's Alliance at the University of Oregon in 71. And they used the coffee house as a kind of informal base for planning. They would have meetings other places. Now, the coffee house only lasted 2 years, but that and its relationship to the sort of gay student organizing was fairly important for Bill. Another one was the New World Coffee House. Sorry, that's supposed to be for gay men, not game men, to hang out and socialize, and Bill said, in a safe alcohol and smoke-free atmosphere. Bill loved playing chess. He was is a very good chess player, as was his father. And this is, in fact, where Bill and Franz first met, right? So this was that kind of meeting place. There was a gay bar in Eugene at the time. It was in the basement of an old Trailways bus depot. It had one noisy kind of raucous front room and a quiet piano bar in the back. Bill said that that was an important, locus for people, right? You could come into that space and at least feel safe within it. Some of the people of the goat farm, or of the collective, Venice Collective, also the people who had founded the Alliance at the University of Oregon, opened up a goat farm and sold milk, cheese, yarn, and other things. And Bill was proud of this because he felt that it demonstrated to others that gay men could be successful farmers, that gay men could do the things that other men do, right? So that we can operate on your turf just fine and make it happen. And he said that he was really quite proud of the work that they did. This one's a little racier here. The Meadowview Tree Farm was up in that general area. It's about 25, 30 miles outside of Eugene, kind of toward the Coast Range. And Bill would oftentimes work there during Christmas on the Christmas tree farm in the 60s and 70s. He'd work in the lookout towers over the summer and then come back down and cartoon and do art and find odd jobs and so on. And out there, it was a guy that Bill called Uncle Bob, who was a really positive element and when it came to the gay community in Oregon. He did a lot of taking in sort of homeless or evicted gay men, giving a place to camp or stay as long as they, kept it cool and didn't damage the tree farm, right? So it was a known spot in this rural places. If you got kicked out of someplace, or if you needed to sort of a safe space to go, you could go to Uncle Bob's tree farm in Meadowview, in Oregon. But starting in 1962, Uncle Bob started having a camp out, and it ran to the 20-teens. And at this camp out in July every year, and it's not the Oregon Country Fair, that's something totally different, right? At this camp out, hundreds of gay men, Bill said, who badly needed a place to celebrate being gay among hundreds of men like them, men, would show up there. There was nude volleyball and swimming. There was a pavilion, there was a flatbed trailer for a stage. They had with a piano on it, a beer truck. They had a semi full of kegs. Darcel, a famous, well-known drag queen from Portland, regularly went down and performed. But Bill said this wasn't really about drag. It was about finding a safe place to be, a rural space to be openly gay. In the early 1970s, the people there even made a campy film about Bigfoot. And they used the tree flocking equipment to help Big Tom, who was 6'6", look like the Bigfoot of legend. And so this is where Bill's tentative title for the book was going to be Even Bigfoot Was Gay, which I promised I'd explain to you. And then in the early 80s, the Tree Farm annual campout actually became an important venue to distribute information about AIDS, right? And so Oregon health officials came and worked with Uncle Bob and the other kind of core group of people who helped sort of conduct this thing to try to get information about AIDS and AIDS prevention and healthcare into the gay community and so on. So I'm going to show you a few pictures from this event. A couple of them are racy, just if you have concern about that, I'll say that ahead of time. So this is from an early version of the campout in about 1968-69. And you can see these men here at the tree farm here sitting around the campfire. This is the stage in the back, the campout stage. This is about 3 in the morning. Bill thinks it might be the very first one in 1962. You can see that they're dressed a little bit differently in this one. And you can see, you know, having a chance to be expressive and intimate and finding those spaces to do that more important for these folks. Here's a little bit later. This is in the 1970s or early, probably late 1970s. And there's the beer truck in the background. And we're not engaged in nude volleyball, but we're playing volleyball in this one. Here's the stage performance. They had, you know, the best nude contest there. And so you can see the kinds of things that were happening. This is the racy part. And there's the Bigfoot filming incident from the 1970s. They used the flocking equipment to create fake snow and all kinds of things, so it looked like Bigfoot was in the snow. So this is a Big Tom here dressed up in his non-breathing Bigfoot costume. I just thought it was funny and fun and playful and creative, right? And, you know, this is a space in a rural setting where it was safe to be openly out and gay. Lookout towers were for Bill as well, and sometimes, and he met people. He had this little Morris Minor pickup, and he had the license plate gland on it because he thought it looked like a yellow jaundiced gland, and I'll leave you to decide what kind of gland it looked like. But one Forest Service guy jokingly said to him, oh, gland, does that stand for the gay liberation of the American desert? And Bill said, no, it's the gay liberation of the American northern desert. So we had the N in there. But this is that kind of coding thing, right? Where this came up and Bill developed a relationship with this other person that lasted a lifetime of at least a friendship out of all of this. But when Bill was at the lookout, for him to have intimate relations with anybody, it required a 12-mile hike in. They always ran the risk of getting caught by casual hikers or unannounced Forest Service employee visitors or fire crew visits, right? So it seems isolated, but you never know when somebody's going to show up. And he had other meetings at ranger stations from time to time when other people went away for a weekend, but it was really hard, right? And so you know, the isolation doesn't mean safety or security, really. It means that you are still potentially vulnerable in rural spaces. And Bill had to be clandestine and coded in his activities during much of this time, right? And I think it made a difference, right? It was hard to have open relationships, and it was very hard to make those last. Now, the one that did last were Bill and Franz, who met at the New World Coffee House. They collaborated in the Van Ness house and partnered for a monogamous, at least as Bill describes it, relationship for 50 years. And Bill said, look, they've had their ups and downs, right? It's not been idyllic and perfect the whole time, but it's been a real relationship, and they're still together. And they continue to seek connections, right, with artistic and intellectual group of gay men in Central Oregon, but both are aging. Bill's now nearly 80 and Franz is nearly 70. And it's harder and harder for them to get out and socialize. So, you know, they're feeling more vulnerable as they're aging too. And especially being elderly and gay, it's sort of interesting kind of component of intersectionality for them that I don't think that they had really thought about until the last 10 years or so. So, you know, I guess the question is here, what connections have been important, right? What collectives are there? Is it, you know, a center on a campus? Is it a private space and these types of things? Or are there individuals, you know, is there an Uncle Bob or an Uncle Bill for you? EJ, are you okay if I keep going for just a couple more minutes?
We have about 5 more minutes left.
I'm going to skip to something I think is really important here.
Okay.
When I found out about my father-in-law coming out as bisexual and so on, Bill spent 3 to 4 hours talking with me, right, about this and helping me understand this in the late 1980s and early 1990s. And he's provided support to a lot of other people. In particular, his great-grandniece, Cassidy. Cassidy was born intersex and assumed to be male. She had a single mother with a string of abusive boyfriends who tortured her and her mother physically and mentally, cigarette burns and all kinds of things like this. Not till Cassidy was in her 30s did she find a path through counseling, medical treatments, and so on to declare as a woman. And she turned to Bill to tell her story. Bill said, she's one of the bravest people I know, ever known. To think that someone so young and sensitive and shy could possibly endure an emotional and prolonged trauma that she was put through makes one pause to wonder how she made it through such trying and soul-searching experiences. She's eagerly accepting the challenges of everyday life with the help of loving friends, family, and a truly dedicated husband. It's a lesson for us all in bravery that still continues today and into the future for Cassidy. He said, I won't ever feel hard for myself again or complain about things. And he thanks his great grandniece, Cassidy, for sharing her life experience with us. And there's a more detailed letter that she wrote him about all of this. And it's really gut-wrenching. Bill said, as for myself, I'm still here and going to be into the 2020s with the pandemic sweeping the globe. He said he survived age just by dumb luck. Like so many of us survivors, I often have a feeling of guilt. I will admit a good portion of my life was spent in self-imposed exile far out in the Oregon outback on forest fire lookouts. In fact, Bill said that 1980s picture of the stage where they were walking through with the best nude performance, he said at least half those people were dead in the next 5 years. And so, it really rips a hole in his heart to see that community gutted by that. So there were costs, right? Every job was temporary, unstable, and threatened. Every negative public interaction is attributed by Bill largely to homophobia, right? He reads it this way, whether it is or not, and understandably. And a lifetime of struggle and near daily questioning is never easy. And Bert, you've mentioned, and EJ, you're still facing that. And so know that some of us know, and people like Bill certainly know and have lived that life too, right? So, among your families of origin and choice, who have been your uncles, aunts, who have been your people, right? Who has been there for you? Bill's been there for me. And especially in the last couple of years, I went down to visit Bill here. Who we relied on when we are in need to help us, ground us, to see how we can find paths through difficult times. And I'll have to say, most recently, my father had a lot of mental health issues late in his life, and he passed away a little more than a year ago. And Bill helped me negotiate those. And Bill, in essence, became the father that I lost. And I had a decent relationship with my father before this episode of the last 4 or 5 years. So I've been able to turn to Bill again about a lot of different things. And I really, really appreciate that. By the way, Trix the rabbit, Bill insisted that should be in the background. And it was about 100 degrees in there because he had the damn wood stove on. And it was really, really hot. And that's why I'm so red. Bill, by the way, used to be at least an inch taller than me. So he's shrunk some in his dotage here. But he sends me about 2 or 3 letters a week, as I said. This is his Happy Holidays letter from Uncle Bill. He sends newspaper clippings, cartoons, commentaries, all kinds of things. And I was going to end with this, but one of the most touching ones for me, actually, that I just found this afternoon in the large pile of stuff was this one. This was something that Bill did about 2007, and a good friend of his and Franz passed away, John Voorhees. Who was, as Bill said, a wonderful friend, great gentleman, and an inspiration to us all. And they were quite moved to it, right? So here are Bill and Franz sitting in the mountains where John Voorhees loved to be. Franz has got his hand on Bill's leg. Bill's got his hand around Franz, his arm around Franz. Franz is crying. And they're crazy cat people, so they've got cats all around them. But I think this is what the best of Bill's life has been about: a partnership, a lifetime partnership with Franz, love of the outdoors, and being emotional about loving other men. And so that's kind of how I wanted to end. And so thank you if I went a few minutes over on this thing.
That is okay. It was absolutely wonderful.
That's why I think my Uncle Bill's story is worth telling. I mean, there's a lot more to tell, you know, from his Trotskyite liberationist kind of things to all kinds of things. So thank you for your time. And thank you for those of you who are saying thank you too. You know, feel free to contact me anywhere along the line about any of this stuff, you know, and thank you for letting me tell you about my Uncle Bill.
Thank you so very much.
And thank you for everybody who joined us tonight. It was definitely a pleasure to hold this space for you, Chris. That way you can tell us a little bit more about your Uncle Bill's life. It was very
I really
interesting.
appreciate the opportunity. You know, if you'll keep the Zoom link open, whoever wants to leave or can do so, I'm happy to answer a few more questions or comments if anybody has anything. So
Yeah, we can definitely do that.